Sí.
Thank you very much. That's great. Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Tengo una presentación.
Ya está listo.
Creo que sí.
Angela,
Sí.
the presentation's already there. You got it? Right, fantastic. Entonces te voy a presentar y puedes hacerlo desde aquí o desde allá, como quieras.
Perfecto. Igual me paro.
Sí.
¿Está bien? ¿O te
Venga,
vas a
sí, no,
parar?
perfecto, perfecto.
Y así además no se nota tanto.
¿Perdón? ¿Hemos?
Está perfecto.
Thank you. Moving right along, I would just like to say that we're still waiting for Special Envoy Hochstein to get here. He's actually sort of entering the building right now, but we're going to begin the panel so we don't keep you waiting. It is an enormous pleasure for me to have a dear friend with us once again. Dr. Cesar Hernandez was here with us last year for our first Energy Forum. And as I said then, we've been friends for a number of years, and we've worked together on various different projects. And Dr. Hernandez is the Undersecretary for Mexico for Energy, for Electricity. He has previously been the head of CENER's legal affairs. And at that time when he was in that position, we had a number of very, very interesting conversations about what the reform would potentially look like and what, in fact, the reform needed to be, whether it needed to be constitutional or not. He's an incredibly wise man. And I have to point out that he's part of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy's mafia that seems to run the world these days. Everywhere you go, you seem to bump into them. It's extraordinary how many of your classmates and fellow sort of alumni are in positions of importance these days. Cesar Hernandez is here to talk about the opening of Mexico's electricity sector, the definition of the market rules which have recently been issued. And just one comment at the beginning that I'd like to make is that it's extraordinary how little attention has been put on Mexico's electricity opening in international circles. When you compare it with the amount of money that's involved in the contracts, the investments that are going to come in and already coming into Mexico, the investments that are taking place by the national utility, the CFE already, we're talking about multi-billion-dollar investments in infrastructure, in generation, in transmission, etc., and a complete transformation of a market, which of course has massive implications for what we talked about about on the first panel to do with natural gas. And so it's fascinating to see how this is shaping up, and it's moving ahead just as on the oil and gas side, it's moving ahead quickly. But what's different about the electricity side, I think, is that the benefits of the electricity opening are going to be felt, are already being felt by Mexican society in a much more tangible way than the oil and gas opening is showing so far. Already, as I imagine that Cesar will talk about, electricity rates have come down in Mexico, in particular for industrial consumers, providing a boost to Mexican competitiveness in the short term. And as we always try to argue here at the Mexico Institute, when Mexico advances in competitiveness, that's a good thing for North American manufacturing, given the fact of intense integration of manufacturing production systems in North America. So as you see those advances in competitiveness due to low fuel costs and low electricity costs in Mexico, that's good for the North American manufacturing value chain. I'm not going to talk anymore. I would just like to welcome you, Dr. Hernandez. Great to have you back again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Duncan, and thank you for having me here again. What I would like to do in this presentation is basically tell some of the things that Duncan already summed up, but that probably merit a bit more descriptive and detailed explanation. So the structure of the presentation, which is basically say what we have done up to now, and where we were 1 year ago is not the same place we are now, how the new industry structure looks like after some of the reforms have taken place, how the new transmission planning is being done in Mexico, how is it different from the way it was in the past, some of the plans for cross-border transmission strengthening the links between Mexico, the States, and Central America, how the power market was designed in Mexico, imports and exports of electricity, and what the next steps will be. So I'll start by saying what the objective was of the electric reform in Mexico. And it had to do with three things. First, lowering rates of electricity. It was the thing that mattered the most to Mexican consumers. It was actually the selling point for the energy reform as a whole. Both the hydrocarbons and the electricity package were sold to the population on the basis that they would mean lower electricity rates for the population. And that was, in every opinion poll that was conducted back then, the selling point, the thing that convinced people to support any reform. They were not concerned about corruption, about the modernization of Pemex or CFE, about competitiveness of Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. They were concerned about how much they were paying for electricity. And the reason was, and you can see in the chart there, that Mexico's electricity rates were much higher than those comparable in the United States. In every segment, whether it was industrial, commercial, residential, Mexico paid more for electricity than its Mexicans paid more for electricity than its counterparts in the States. The only segment where electricity was cheaper in Mexico, and that was because Mexico invested between 1 percentage point and 3/4 of a percentage point of GDP, was the low-income subsidized electricity rates paid by consumers. But if you looked at the costs that were implied in that electricity, they were still much higher than those of Mexico's counterparts. Other objectives, which were also important, was to promote the use of clean energies. Clean energies have a strong potential in Mexico that was incredibly underdeveloped. To promote investment, we wanted the reform to attract investors from other parts of the world and to guarantee transparency. As it was in the hydrocarbons area, in electricity, it was very important that the reform was seen as transparent by all the participants, that no acts of corruption would be involved, that all the disciplines and all the procedures that were involved in the new market rules, in the new operation of the system, were subject to public scrutiny, that they would be publicly consulted with industry and everyone. So, and that was particularly important in the energy arena because, not only because the the image of the government and the issue of corruption is very strong these days, but also because energy is seen as an arena where the opportunities for misconduct are bigger than in any other sector. So for us, it was very important for this to be a credible reform, that we made sure that there was transparency and public consultation and all sorts of procedures of this sort involved. How were we going to achieve those objectives? That was also very important for us. We were going to do it through competition. We were going to create an electricity market in Mexico. Electricity markets are an old thing in the world. They started in the 90s, so some of them are 20 years old. Colombia, which is a country which is important, but which has a GDP considerably inferior to that of Mexico, either per head or on a per capita basis or as a whole, has 20 years of experience in this type of market. The US, 70% of the country is run by electricity markets, and it is a set of institutions that work and that bring competition, and that competition helps lower tariffs and costs in the industry. So we wanted to have that in Mexico because, among other things, we did not want to do a lowering of tariffs by decree. We did not want to go ahead in the same road of subsidies that had been used in the past, but we wanted to have structural reasons for the lowering of tariff rates. We wanted to introduce a new instrument that had some teeth in it, that had some way of making sure that it was complied with for the promotion of clean energies, and that's we developed a renewable portfolio standard, or rather a clean energy portfolio standard that was made mandatory for all the consumers of electricity, and that had to be that had the backing of some strong sanctions if you did not comply with these new rules. And we wanted to have a different type of planning for the expansion of the electricity grid, a type of planning that did not see Mexico as an island, but rather as a place in the world that was more connected both to its northern and to its southern neighbors. We wanted to have a conception of the grid that involved interconnections, international trade, and all that. And that was very different from the way it was done in the past. So that's a brief summary of what contains the whole presentation. I will go quickly through some of the other slides. This is what we have done since last year, basically, or even since the publishing of the amendment to the Mexican Constitution. Mexico's Constitution was probably very open in every segment of the economy except for energy. In energy, you had mandated, constitutionally mandated energy monopolies, both for the hydrocarbons and for the electricity arena. And so it was very important to amend the Constitution. That has to do with some of the discussions that Duncan Wood and I had back in 2007 and then in 2011. I back then maintained that it wasn't necessary to amend the Constitution. Now, I have changed my opinion, and I think it was the greatest idea we could have had. I'm glad I lost that debate. But anyway, so that was done in December 2013. In August 2014, we published what we call the secondary legislation, which was basically the implementing legislation of the constitutional amendment, which was a very impressive package of new laws and amendments to old laws, including a completely new hydrocarbons law and a completely new electric industry law, which were published back then in August. And very soon after the publication of the law, we started the implementation package. We first created what is the basis of the electricity market, which was to create an independent system operator. We took a part of CFE out of CFE, which was the part in charge of dispatch. We took some areas which were in charge of planning the expansion of the system, in charge of dealing with interconnection applications for the grid, and we put them together in a new public entity called CENACE, the Center for Energy, the National Center for Energy Control. And that's going to be, and that was conceived as to be in charge of operation of the system, of dispatch of all the units, and also of running the new wholesale electricity market. And that was done in 3 weeks. It was very fast. Very soon after we did that, and by November of that year, we managed to have all the assets that were formerly CFEs transferred formally to the new entity. And very recently, we managed to finish the negotiation with the union. So practically, the new organism it has its own workers, it has its own assets. It's been doing the things that the reform said it would do. So we are very satisfied with the way that SENACE's creation and evolution has gone. We created a new electrification fund, which is going to start working in January next year when it has resources. It is funded through the market with some small percentage that is contributed by all the persons that use the transmission grid. So it's also a way of legitimizing the new model, because since this is a market-oriented model, we want to make sure that people do not criticize it because they think that it fails to accomplish some of the public service objectives that were achieved through the old monopolistic model. So we want people to feel that when we go and deliver electricity service to the poorest of the Mexicans, that has been done through the contribution of all market participants, and that's one of the good things of the new model. So, and we have done all sorts of regulation, which I won't go into detail, but basically we started to create all the regulation that goes beneath the secondary legislation, the regulation of how you apply for interconnection with the grid, how you apply for permits for entry into the market. We established in March this year the clean energy certificate requirement, which is the clean energy portfolio standard that will apply starting 2018. For the first time it was done. We published in August, by the end of July actually, the system expansion program, the new Prodecen, which I will explain a little bit more. And very recently, a couple of weeks ago, we published the market rules. They had been in consultation since February this year, and we incorporated all sorts of comments from industry participants. And in the end, once we felt that we had a consensus reached with the industry, both national and international companies commented on the market rules, we put it for a final stage of public consultation at the Federal Improvement Federal Regulatory Improvement Commission's webpage. We've not received any additional comments, and we proceeded to publish it. The same day that we published the market rules, we also had an event together with the regulator, the Energy Regulatory Commission, in which they announced the new transmission rates for the grid. So we had two of the elements that are necessary for the start of the market already in place. That which was done by the ministry, which were the market rules, which were only done for a one-time case by the ministry. After this, they will be kept current by the Federal Commission, the regulator, the CRE, and we also had the transmission rates. So now you can plan projects because you know how much it's going to cost you to deliver the energy to your customers and for the use of the grid. This is what the new industry structure looks like. If you looked at it before, it was basically a structure where no independent system operator existed, no SENACE was there. CFE was acting as a whole, an entity that controlled all the segments. Now it's a participant along with other participants. In transmission, which I will go a little bit into more detail later, we basically have a moderate form of private participation, which is basically consistent with best international practices, and which is starting this year, in which private companies will be able to develop transmission lines along the whole country, as long as they have some sort of contract with CFE, a contract that has to be tendered. There has to be a competitive process to award that contract, and the contractual terms are very competitive international. So we are very confident that this will be a new way of developing the grid with the help of private participants, and we plan to do the same for distribution, so that if private companies can help CFE run a special area of the country in terms of the distribution network, they will be able to do it, and we will develop contractual models on which they can participate in that. And the rest of the segments are free to private participation, both in the consumption level. There is a class of users which are called qualified users, which are the free users, basically. And the basic service users, they depend on the basic service provider, which is CFE, but CFE has to acquire the energy that is supplied to these consumers through competitive processes, so that there is competition in every step of the value chain of the industry now. I said before that we had, in June this year, published a new document called Prodecen, which is the new instrument for the planning of the expansion of the grid. It has a 15-year period in which the expansion is considered. It says basically where the new generation will be, where the new transmission lines will be built. It is a mandatory instrument. It means that the transmission lines included in this process have to be built. It is an instrument which is also part of the new model in Mexico, which contemplates private participation. So some of the lines, and it is specified in the document, have to be developed with the help of private parties. And some of the most important transmission lines that were contemplated in this first edition of PRODECEN, particularly a transmission 1,200 kilometer transmission line that goes from Tehuantepec to the center of the country, will be the first to be constructed with this new model. It is a document that, as I said before, looks at Mexico not as an island that has to be self-sufficient, but as a country that is interconnected with its northern and southern border countries. And it is an instrument that is published by the ministry and not by CFE, which means basically that we look at the needs of all the participants, not only CFE, but also the private participants, where they plan to build their generation plants, and we will make sure that transmission lines pass through those places so that they can inject their energy into the system. And this is the first time that it's been done by the ministry, so we were very proud when we published it, because it is a very technical document, very sophisticated for standards. It managed to do the same that the previous document published by CFE, which was called POISE, did for a long period of time, and we complied with the same level of technical quality and with a new outlook and a new way of thinking about these things. These are some of the projects that are considered in this new 15-year plan. As you see, there are some which are also in the northern part, in the border region with the United States. There is, as I said before, the new mechanisms for private participation in transmission, which are up to international standards. That's how transmission lines with private participations are done in Brazil, in some European and Asian countries. In some cases, probably our contractual model will be even more flexible and more amicable to private participation. In the case of border interconnections, as you probably know, Mexico does not have a very strong set of border connections with the United States. They are mainly used for emergency backups or for some opportunistic transactions between the two countries. There are lots of opportunities that can be taken advantage of if we build stronger interconnections. And the first step towards doing that is basically changing the mindset, at least on the Mexican side, and thinking that international trade of energy is a good thing for the both countries, and that studies have to be done about how to take advantage of these opportunities, so that these very low capacity interconnections are expanded in a much more significant ways. In a calculation quickly done in the ministry, we estimated that an annual savings of $125 to $300 million could be achieved through stronger interconnections between both countries. In PRODECEN, no new big transmission projects between Mexico and the States or Mexico and Central America were mandated, but several studies for interconnections were mandated. So although we are not mandating the construction of a line, because among other things we cannot do that without having a very strong coordination with the system operators in the border states in the US, we mandated SENACE, the Independent System Operator of Mexico, to start producing the studies and start doing the contacts with its counterparts in the States to build these interconnections and to see how they could be achieved in a reasonably short period of time. So that when we publish PRODECEN next April, which is very soon actually, we probably will include some cross-border interconnection opportunities as projects that are mandated under the new plan, if we manage to achieve the cooperation that we are planning to get, also with Central America, with Guatemala. Just very briefly to explain to you some of the characteristics of Mexico's wholesale electricity market. It is a market that includes 4 different types of products: energy and ancillary services, capacity, clean energy certificates, financial transmission rights. Each of these sub-markets is good for a different thing. The capacity market makes sure basically that we have enough capacity to attend peaks in demand and that we build enough plants to attend future demand. the clean energy certificate market, make sure that we comply with the clean energy requirements that we establish every year, and that there is a mechanism to trade and to make it easy for all the participants to comply with this. And financial transmission rights is a mechanism that has been in use for more than 15 years, I think, in PJM and in other great markets, and is very efficient for dealing with congestion issues in the net. So here are some of the basic descriptions. One of the important things about the markets, the different sub-markets included in Mexico's wholesale electricity market, is basically that they follow what we see as best international practices. We did not want to create a set of market rules that were up to the standards used 15 years ago or that are developing country very modest standards. We think that Mexico deserves to have the best in every one of these in every one of these areas. We wanted to have a system of market rules spoken by Mexico's electricity system that was able to talk in equal terms with its counterparts in the US, with the California Independent System Operator, with CAISO, with ERCOT, with all the different systems, and that basically use the same type of institutions and the same type of rules, or at least rules that could be harmonized very easily. So in the spot market, we have nodal prices. We have a day ahead and current day operations. In the capacity market, we are basically modeling our rules on rules used in the United Kingdom, in PJM, in the New York ISO, in the clean energy certificate market with a clean energy portfolio standard. We also have a set of best international practices applied in other top countries which are applied in Mexico. And the same thing with the financial transmission rights market. There is, in the new design of the rules for the operation of the market, a set of new opportunities for cross-border transactions of energy. For every different type of import or export of electricity, there is a way to get it done through the new system in a much more compatible way with the way it's being done in other systems than it was in previous rules in Mexico. So that's one of the reasons that we anticipate that a stronger interconnection will be possible in the future between Mexico and the United States. What are the next steps that for the implementation of the electric energy reform in Mexico? Until now, we have set upon ourselves a very demanding schedule of things to be published, to be done in a very, very strict and limited time. And we have managed to get credibility with the industry in Mexico and in other countries because we have actually complied with the schedule that we have set on ourselves. So when I look at some of these slides and I think, well, this is very demanding, it is very difficult for me now because now the people believe us. Before they did not. So it's going to be even riskier if we do not comply with this, but we will. So basically, Mexico's wholesale electricity market will begin operations on the 1st of January of next year. That's the plan. That's all the work we have been doing until now. And before that, by the end of October this year, we will have we will publish a tender for the first long-term basic service supply auctions. Auctions in which the basic service supplier in Mexico, CFE, will buy energy, ancillary services, capacity, and clean energy certificates. They will be the first time that CFE will acquire all these products through a competitive process that does not involve a single supplier, but basically that will be open to all sorts of private participants and also to its own projects. CFE, acting through subsidiaries or through affiliates, will be able to sell also energy in these auctions if it manages to win the auctions. The auctions will be awarded to the best bidders, of course, the ones that offer the cheaper electricity, whether they are private or they are public. Pemex will be able to participate in these projects. It will be a new way of contracting energy, and it changes the whole logic of the system, where before a single entity, a government-owned single entity, decided which projects to build, how much to charge, what was a good price for that, where to put the projects. And in this new system, basically, everyone has to compete to inject its energy into the national system. And these auctions, if I may say so, are generating a good deal of good expectations among industry participants, both national and international, and we hope to see a lot of participation in the auctions that we will award March next year. There are also dates for the start of the capacity market, the auctions for energy and capacity for midterm for 3-year contracts, which will also be awarded by the end of next year. And the clean energy certificate market, although the first contracts for clean energy certificates will be awarded in these auctions that we will call in October this year and award in March next year, the market as a market will start working in 2018. So what will all this mean for Mexico? This is a chart that we extracted from a working paper published by some researchers affiliated with the IMF. And basically it shows what those researchers thought the impact of a lowering of electricity rates would mean for Mexico's GDP and for its manufacturing industry. And as you can see there, Mexico's GDP may grow up to 1 percentage point more or up to 2.2 percentage points more if electricity rates converged with those of the states. And that's a thing we have already seen done in the last year due to lower fuel prices, basically. Industrial rates have come down around 30%, commercial rates have come down around 20%, and but we do not want that to be a one-time gain due to international situation. We want that to be based on competitiveness, on competition, and that's why we are introducing an electricity market. In manufacturing, the expansion of manufacturing input due to lower electricity rates is up to 14% more. That's a very, very significant impact of a single reform that can have a crucial sector of Mexico's economy, which is manufacturing. When we looked at electricity rates in Mexico and compared with Germany, which is another industrialized nation, which is export-oriented and very much connected to international trade flows, it was always paradoxical that Mexico had incredibly high electricity rates and still was competitive, whereas Germany actually subsidized industry electricity and was also competitive. But that only went to show us that we could be even much more competitive if we managed to have a competitive input in electricity in this arena where we are already very competitive. Regional integration, what does these reforms mean for the regional market? There are many opportunities, as I said before, to be gained. Not only that amount I mentioned of $125 to $300 million that could be saved by the systems if stronger interconnections were built between the countries. You can have lower reserve margins in all the systems of the region because you can attend peak demand in the region if it is more integrated with plants in any of the countries. There are many opportunities for optimization of the systems. Mexico is already applying, as I said before, there are contacts between the new organism, SENACE, and its counterparts in the States. It's considering applying to be a member of CAISO, of the California Independent System Operator System. So, and this will go on and on in the next years. We will see many opportunities that are there, that are logical, being taken advantage of. Trade in energy, trade in electricity makes as much sense as trade in goods and in other things. It's basically an opportunity that we have not taken advantage of and that is there for the taking if we manage to get the will and the institutions to achieve that. So with that, I would end the presentation. Thank you very much.
That was a terrific presentation, Subsecretario Hernandez. Thank you so much. I'm delighted that you spent so much time talking about Mexico's position, geographic position in the region, its connection into electricity and energy markets in general. And it made me think, of course, of the implications, not just for Mexican development competitiveness, but also what that really does mean for Central America. And that's been an issue that I know has been on the agenda between Mexico and the United States in conversations over cooperation in the region. But also something that has been in, of huge importance for Mexico's diplomacy with the region of Central America. And there are very, very exciting prospects if those kind of connections, both in electricity and natural gas transmission, can be completed in the near future. I am delighted to welcome Amos Hochstein, Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Energy Affairs at the Department of State. He oversees U.S. foreign policy engagement in the critical intersection of energy and national security. In this role, he advises the Secretary on global energy security and diplomacy, as well as promotes U.S. interests to ensure energy resources are used to increase economic opportunity, stability, and prosperity around the world. We've provided a perfect segue into your presentation. Welcome to the Wilson Center. Thank you so much for coming out here, and the podium is yours.
Thank you, and my apologies for being a couple of minutes late, but I'm glad I caught the presentation, Undersecretary. It was a very impressive presentation, but also a reminder of the great efforts that Mexico has been doing. Thank you, Duncan, for having me, and I think you're right. The segue could not have been better. I think as we look at the presentation that we just saw, and the critical work that's been done over the last couple of years in Mexico, it begs the question that as we cooperate, how do we broaden the aperture? How do we broaden that lens to look at this as a region? And let me put the context in which I see all of this. We are in a transformative, revolutionary time in energy writ large. We are living through what I believe is an era in energy that will be taught for decades to come. We are seeing coincidental transformation happening across the entire spectrum of energy. From oil, where we had a relatively limited number of country producers that were controlling the market, both within a cartel and without, to now where we've seen somewhat of a democratization of the oil and gas market, where we have new producers coming online, a declining U.S. Becoming a resurgent U.S., but that's not only true in the United States, it's true across the globe, where new producers at smaller and medium volumes are coming on the market and not wanting to listen to anybody else's rules, but say, I want my seat at the table as a producer. And I would like to look at it from a market perspective rather than a geopolitical one when I decide how much I'm going to produce or how little I will produce. That's true in natural gas, obviously, but it's also true in renewable energy. And while we see these great headlines across the financial newspapers and the mainstream press about oil price drops 60%, natural gas drops 50%, et cetera, we don't see as many of the headlines, but they should be there. They're just as important of the significant reduction in price of renewable energy and solar and wind, and the ability to harness geothermal. And new technologies that are coming on board in the electricity markets, in off-grid as well as microgrids and so on. And utilization of that is expanding. And efficiency rates, which we don't talk enough about, but it's the best way to do more with less. And that's the first dollar you save is actually on efficiency. So across the board, we're seeing in the energy sector this transformation, while a geographic consumer base is changing. So as the demand used to be driven entirely by the OECD countries, we've seen that flip for the first time in history and probably for the foreseeable future, where the non-OECD countries are going to be driving that demand. And that has great implications. The same is true on the supply side, as I said before. So people talk about this as, a U.S. revolution, where we've seen the shale gas revolution followed by a shale oil revolution, followed by a massive investment in renewable energy and integration that far outpaced any of the expectations and projections just 3-4 years ago, where we're completing a transformation from going from coal to gas in our electricity market, and for the first time actually using more gas than coal this past just a few months ago. So these are real transformative mechanisms that are happening, developments that are happening in the United States. But I don't believe this is a U.S. story. I believe this is a North America story. And we have to start looking at things not as individual countries, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Canada, what's happening in Mexico, and we have to start looking at this as a region. And this is a North America revolution, and I think Vice President Biden said it well when he said that North America is the epicenter of energy for the world in the first half of the 21st century. I think that really is true. And, you know, it used to be that whenever the OPEC guys met, you'd have everybody with bated breath waiting in New York and London. What will the wise men come out and tell us about our economies? But they're actually more interested today in what's happening in Mexico City, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Canada, and how we all work together. And if we can make and take advantage of this opportunity, what that will do. That's where the news is being generated. So this is a great opportunity. And why is it a great opportunity? Because there are 300 million people in the middle class in Central America. And that's what a great opportunity looks like. It's a hemisphere that's endowed with, oil, gas, diverse and rich array of renewable energy resources, from geothermal that we just talked about in Mexico and Central America, and hydroelectric power, which is dominant in Canada, but also a big story in Central America, which also leads you into what the challenges that this region faces. Because as we talk about hydro, climate change is making that a complicated resource, where you have a couple of years of good rainfall and we don't see a need for reform or change in the governmental structures. And then you have a few years of droughts and everybody's crying, we got to do something. And before we get anything done, we have a good rain year, and now we're back to, well, maybe those decisions can wait a little bit. And I'll get to that. And the low oil prices that have helped fuel some progress and change in the region, are not guaranteed to come. The same guys in the and women in the investment banking world who wrote the notes in June, July of 2014, where they said, quote, $100 oil is the new floor, are the same exact people who wrote 6 months later, we don't see $60 as a floor. And we, in fact, saw it go down even further. So oil prices, I'm asked a lot about what's your prediction on what will happen to oil prices, and beyond saying that if I knew that, I'd be wearing a more expensive suit and I'd have a different job. But the only thing I can guarantee is whatever the price is today is not what it's going to be. It will be lower, it will be higher, and that's the nature of a commodity market, especially a volatile commodity market like the oil markets have always been and will always be. So why am I having this conversation? Why are we having this conversation? Because in the region, in Central America, you have 7 countries that combined are about, the power sector of all 7 countries combined is about the size of the state of Maryland. That's very small. And you can't expect to attract new investment at the scale that ministers often talk about, or the press wants, or people demand, when you divide that state of Maryland up into 7 independent markets. It's very difficult to make the economic case, the business case for that. What it calls for is coming together, is joining forces and becoming a regional market that can attract that kind of investment. And that's the key. Because what we're trying to say with 300 million people in the middle class is, how do you grow the economy? That's the bottom line. How do you create better future? But nothing is more fundamental to economic growth than energy. Nothing is more fundamental than being able to have access to reliable and affordable sources of power. I'm not going to start a business if I don't know if I'm going to be able to flip the switch in the morning. There's no chance. So I have to be able to have a stable energy market that is able to also grow. And that's why it's so critical that we come together to do this. So how do you do that? In the last few years, we've started to see what it could look like if countries come together. So in Central America, we saw the last several years working on the establishment of a regional electricity line that runs from Guatemala to Panama, CPAC, which took an enormous amount of work. And because getting it right is extremely difficult, you have to get policies, regulations, and technical issues, and all this with several different government structures, political systems, national laws that all have to be done. But it got done. And that meant that the trade tripled just in the last 2 years. but it's nowhere near enough. That's a great, fantastic first step. The problem is that this market is mainly being used as an emergency backup system, by and large, and not as an actively traded electricity market. And that's what needs to change. So what do we need to do? We got to take some concrete steps. We have to do things such as upgrade the domestic transmission lines across the region. Because as we talk about growing the trade in the line, if you don't have an upgrade of the transmission line, you're as good as your weakest link. So there has to be investment in each country. Each country has to make the commitment to make those investments together with help from the outside. The IDB and others are willing to step in, but we have to have that political commitment to do that. We have to strengthen the governance of the regional market. Especially this comes to when you do have disputes, and I guarantee you we will continue to have disputes. And the problem is not the dispute. The dispute's fine. It's healthy. But if you don't have a mechanism of how to solve that dispute, that everybody understands these are the rules of the game, then those disputes become crippling. And the fear of the dispute become crippling too, so you never even get to the point of dispute, because you don't get to that point. And finally, we got to resolve the technical challenges, and there are a lot of them, and I'm not the right person to go into the details of those, from oscillations that affect all the countries along the line to others. But the only way to do this is to come together and work together as a region. In Canada, the United States, Mexico, and Central America. We have to come together and utilize the mechanisms that we have already in place to work together. And we meet all the time. We have, almost every year we meet in the North America Leaders Summit, where Canada, the United States, and Mexico, we talk about how do we move forward. And I can tell you that increasingly the subject of energy and energy cooperation is dominating the conversation in those leader summits. When President Obama launched the Connect the Americas 2022 together with Colombia, that was done at the Summit of the Americas in 2012. We are all talking about the US and Mexico and Central America, but we all have a common neighbor, and that is all the Caribbean island states, who are using electricity by burning, or producing electricity by burning relatively cheap fuel oil from Venezuela, which they got through getting hooked on addicted to a financial scheme. It's not hooked on the oil itself or the fuel oil itself. It's the financial scheme that's not replaceable when you don't have the credit rating to be able to replace it at a time of emergency. But you're talking about islands that have 10 months of sun. Many of them have great wind potential. Some of them have great geothermal potential, and yet are using dirty fuel oil. So this is a great opportunity for transformation, and it's not about them doing it. It's about getting together to do it. And that's why the Vice President went to the Dominican Republic, and Vice President Biden announced the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative for us, not for the United States to do this, but for us to get together as a region, together with the international financial institutions, to say, we got to take care of this problem. Because the alternative to this problem, if there's a crisis, we will all suffer through those consequences, and there's no reason why the next generation of the Caribbean islands don't live the kind of future that they deserve. So recently, the President of the United States in Panama announced a task force for the Caribbean and Central American energy security. And that was on the margins of the 2015 Summit of the Americas. And the idea behind that is to take all these different things that we're announcing, all these different initiatives for the Caribbean and Central America, the interconnection of our countries, and Connect the Americas 2022, and say, okay, let's take a look for a few months together, and what do we need to do to energize this process, to light a fire under us, and to get real goals of what are the actions, what's the action plan, what are the timelines, how do we involve other countries, other regions, other financial institutions, how do we coordinate so you don't have situations where, if you look at some point how much money has been spent on the different aspects that I just described over the last 20 years, millions, with very little to show for it in some cases. So some of this is those who want to come in and play a role in this, how do we work together so that we know in advance, I'm going to spend some money in this, I'm going to give technical expertise here, and make sure that it is compatible with what my neighbor or my colleagues from other countries are going to be doing, so we can coordinate. not to dictate to each other, but to coordinate so it actually leads to a better action. That's what the point of the task force really is. But I want to go back to a point of saying about how do we look at making real change in Central America. And it's easy to say, let's just all work together. But it's really hard. And whenever I go down or meet with folks here, I'm told, well, all we need is one of two things. We need money, which is nice. I don't have it. Or I need investment. Tell your companies to come and invest here. Now that's great. Now if I could pick up the phone to CEOs across the country and say, hey, listen, forget about your shareholders on the board. I need you to go and invest in this plant. I have no idea if you're going to make any money, but you should go. I do that. But it doesn't work that way. So what do you have to do? You have to, and the Band-Aids that everybody wants, which is the quick fix. How do I get this done so in 6 months from now I have a signing ceremony? That's not going to, there are none. They don't exist. And that's what people have been trying to do and failing for decades. So therefore the task force is going to say, what do we want to do? We want to make change that's fundamental. We want to do this from the bottom up. We want to say if you want to have that investment, you got to do some hard work. You got to take the political decision to want it and to break some eggs in the process. Change your regulations. Change your rules of engagement. Change the kind of contracts that you're willing to offer. Make sure that you have long-term contracts, which is what you just talked about. And you have examples for success. Look what Mexico has done over the last few years. The reforms that the first ones in 1992 and then in 2013, not exactly an easy process. Look at the politics that went through that. I mean, hats off to you. I don't know that we could do anything like that in Washington. We can't pass a bill, let alone a constitutional amendment. That is an incredible amount of work. But it comes from a political commitment to say, I'm willing to do what is necessary. I'm willing to take some political heat. I'm willing to even suffer through some short-term pain in order to get that long-term gain, because that's where we have to get to. And I got to tell you, I meet with companies all the time. There is more interest in Mexico and Central America today than I've ever seen. And I think that has to be harnessed, because all of that will go to waste if we don't do what I'm suggesting. And that is that fundamental change from the bottom up. And if people across the region are willing to make those reforms, are willing to take those tough decisions, I'll tell you one thing. The President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Energy, we're all going to be there to support that process. We'll work with the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and every other institution in order to bring them on board to be able to make that happen. But Mexico has to be a critical element of this. Not only because it's setting the example now of how hard it is, but also what the rewards are. And it's not going to be a single line track of success. You're going to have bid rounds that work better than others. It's going to be a lot of learning by experience. And you're going to realize what you thought was a really attractive term turned out to be not such an attractive term. So let's mess with it a little bit and come back and do it again. But we got to be able to do it together. So over the next few months, we're going to be working together with our colleagues in Mexico and with our colleagues across Central America in order to come up with recommendations and an action plan to move forward, to take advantage of the revolution that's happening in the United States, the abundance of gas, natural gas, the investment opportunities in renewable energy and new technologies, the strengthening of the trading market in the region. If we're able to get all that done, I firmly believe that we are going to be able to be enormously successful in revitalizing the economy of the region and create more prosperity and act as a region and not a collection of single country markets in the very near future. Thank you again.
Fabulous. I don't think I've ever seen two presentations that fitted better together, so thank you so much for that. We have a short period of time for Q&A, so I'd like to take a round of 3 questions if the questions are out there. There's one here, gentleman. And then one here from the lady here, and then one over there. Perfect.
My name's Thomas Grindley. On the world scene, who are the main beneficiaries of the low oil and gas prices? And who are suffering most? What are the main changes in energy flows worldwide? And what are the main foreign policy changes to adjust?
Thank you. Question right there.
Hi, Ileana Sepulveda. Undersecretary Hernandez, one part that I have not heard much of is the retail part of the supply chain of electricity. We have these qualified consumers that are the large consumers, industrial, but then we have these basic service users that is the entire population, and those are going to be still served by a large owned company by the government. So why didn't that was included for private investment or private participation in that part of the supply chain? And do you see that happening, changing in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. And then the question here, right in the very middle, third row back. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Myra Maldonado from the University of Texas at El Paso. Thank you, first of all, to Dr. Cesar Emiliano Hernandez, because he has been helping us with some data that we've been collecting. A quick question about the electricity rates in Mexico. You know that in the sectors across residential, industrial, commercial, all the rates are higher for all the sectors except for the residential compared to the US electrical rates, for example, worldwide. The question is, what are your expectations in these rates to be decreased in how long, given that Mexico is going to have a competitive market, and in particular for the residential sector that is being subsidized highly by the industrial sector, and that's why it is the only sector that has lower rates if you compare it with the worldwide rates. Are you expecting to have an increase in the rates because of the competition for domestic rates in Mexico? And then are you going to expect to increase by how much? Or what is your overall overview? Thank you, Dr. Hernandez.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to add one quick comment on to something that that Special Envoy Hochstein said, which is that the hard work involved, when you look at the hard work that was involved in actually negotiating the CPAC, you know, and the political interests and the, you know, the bargaining that had to take place, it's daunting to think ahead, right? But it does show you what's possible. And when you begin to think about sort of, you know, that's about electricity transmission. But when we begin to think about getting natural gas into Central America, that's something which is a really, really exciting prospect, particularly given the surpluses that exist in the US and the fact that Mexico is building a natural gas pipeline network for the first time. How do we develop a vision that actually, you know, extends down through Mexico into Central America, and who would be sort of the major partners for doing that? It has to be private sector in addition to public sector. But where are we going to get that interest?
I think you got the large question at the beginning.
So, sir, I don't know how many hours you have for a dissertation on the winners and losers and the flows of energy markets. I'll say very quickly on that question that I think that there's no segment that's, you know, the category of winners and losers, except to say obviously that producer states or countries are suffering the most, especially those where hydrocarbons are a significant portion of their income. And I think I'm hoping that this era is a lessons learned in why that's a bad idea. And when you have $100 oil, you should probably save some and invest it back into the broader economy to diversify away. It is that's related to the foreign policy implications, because I believe that we are not paying enough attention to what happens if we have continued low oil prices and low natural gas prices for a longer period and at lower prices than some analysts and others predict, because that could start creating instability in different parts of the world. And we have enough instability currently in the world, but parts that are currently actually stable could switch very quickly if this trend continues. Because if you have 90 to 95% of your income, of your revenues generated from oil or natural gas sales, and the bottom falls out for an extended period of time, and you don't have the $600 billion of a sovereign wealth fund or a reserve to hold you over for a few years, that could be very, very difficult to survive. So I'm personally, that's one of the things that keeps me up at night, I think, and that's true across the world. We have it in our own region, just south of our border. We have a country that's dealing with that kind of a challenge. So I think there are a lot of foreign policy implications to this, but they're all connected to what I said at the beginning. We're in this transformation era of how energy is produced and how it's consumed, and how more efficient we get, and so on. So I'll leave it there because I think it's a very big topic. I don't know if you want to.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
Please.
Do it in order.
the other questions. On the retail side, you were right that I did not spend a lot of time explaining it, but Mexico's market transformation is really important for retail, and it has to do with the fact that first, as you mentioned, there is a threshold which will continually diminish, so that industrial, commercial, and eventually residential users will be able to choose their provider of electricity. And, as you also mentioned, the basic service supply will be tendered, and several companies will compete to offer the lowest, the cheapest electricity to the consumers indirectly through the basic service supplier. How fast do we plan to go in liberating retail? Well, as fast as we can. The reason we set a set of three thresholds initially in the law, which were 3 megawatts, 2 megawatts, and then 1 megawatt, which the market will start with 2 megas, and 10 months afterwards, it will already come down to 1 mega. And we can even accelerate that through administrative decisions. It will depend on how quickly we feel that customers become sophisticated enough to handle these contracts, and that no moral risk is involved in opening in a faster way. By the way, that's the way that every opening in the electricity sector has been done in every country in the world. It comes down gradually, and it works. In Texas, you can see the residential users being able to choose. Retail is also been opened by the new law, so that there are new companies, and we have been visited by several international companies that know how to package electricity in different ways from those that are done by the state-owned electric utility. So we are expecting to see a lot of competition in offers, not only to industrial customers, but also to commercial customers, because basically a market structure is much more amicable to innovation, to business innovation, than what we had before. So we are expecting to see a healthy development of a new industry market that basically wasn't there before, even through initiatives done by the CFE itself. On the other hand, regarding electricity rates which are subsidized, it was a commitment of Mexico's government basically not to eliminate the subsidies for the poorest customers. And it was very important. The initial wording of the electricity industry law had a couple of paragraphs which said that we would try to focus subsidies on the neediest consumers, and it generated such a political turmoil. It was almost going to destroy all the package of reform that the senators that proposed it, they went back on their word and said, oh, it will stay, the support will stay as it is now. And so what we're expecting is that competition will drive down industry and commercial rates very quickly, that these auctions for basic service supplies will drive down the costs of supplying basic service customers, among them some of them that are subsidized, and that we will be able to diminish the amount of resources channeled for this subsidy. But for the poorest customers, they will not see a difference in how much support they are getting. So competition for the free users, and when they want, if they can get a better rate, they will be able to stop being captive consumers of CFE and move to other segments. But those who want to remain there and who appreciate the support that is being given through the subsidy will still be getting the same type of support. The other thing is the cross-subsidy, the subsidy that goes from high industry prices to other areas of rates is really very small. So we do not think that the fact that we are losing that cross-subsidy will affect significantly the way that. If I may just comment on one little thing, on the impact of Mexico's reform for Central America. As I mentioned before, the reason we did this reform is because we believe that we're paying too much for electricity, that there were no incentives in the industry to lower prices, and that the only way to do that in a competitive way, in a long-term way, was through market and market solutions, and that will have a big impact in manufacturing in Mexico. I think that Mexico's example will have also an impact in Central America. When I have talked to authorities in some Central American countries, I feel that the mindset that they have now is they do not feel a pressure, a competitive pressure, to lower their electricity rates. They say, oh, we have enough capacity in Guatemala, so why build more modern plants if we already have the plants that are able to supply all the electricity? It's not about that. We also in Mexico have enough plants to cover the supply of electricity. What we do not have is cheap electricity, competitive plants, modern renewables, all the resources that we have, and that can drive out all those old plants and make it cheaper for industry in our country to manufacture products. And that will also happen to Central America. When they see that Mexico is getting more competitive in textile industry, in some of the industries where Central American countries are actually have a market niche which is stable, and when they see their competitive position eroded, they will have an incentive to transform themselves. And I'm saying this because I think that even if all the governments in the region manage, and we are of course very willing and supportive of any initiative, I think that we have to think about it in market terms, in what is the internal incentive to transform and to take the measures. And also, I mean, it's great if we can get multilateral banks and to put some money, but there are lots of private investors that could put their good money if they feel that they can have a decent return on that and some security that is being done. And if we manage to do those things in Mexico, I mean, the transmission line to connect Mexico's transmission grid with CIEPAC, it's not a technical feat, it's a very simple project. It's a matter of getting the political will for people to think it makes sense to import cheaper electricity, and maybe in the future they can export in the same line on the other, in the other direction if they manage to tap on their untapped and potentially very important resources, for instance, in renewables.
But what you mentioned is exactly the problem, right? Because people say, well, you have Guatemala that has all the capacity, and why do I need to bring on Mexican power, more Mexican power, if I'm not, what does that do to my economy? You have a weakness in the infrastructure in Honduras and El Salvador that have not done the same kind of investment into the system as Guatemala has. So you get, this is how quickly you go from the lofty goal to the, but why should I do this? Interconnection with Mexico is easy, as you said. But it's not only on the CPAC line expansion, it's the same thing, you mentioned, Duncan, the issue of the natural gas pipeline. And so we can have it as a Mexico to Guatemala line, or it can go one that goes throughout the region. But now you're going to get into the question like, well, wait a minute. There's a chicken and an egg here. There's not enough demand. Well, there's not going to be enough demand because who's going to build a factory? Because maybe one day, sometime in the future, you're going to build more capacity. So you got to break, these are the exact cycles that you got to break. I'm not suggesting that the IDB or others should come in and pay for all of this. That will never happen, and we won't support that. But I think we should have a backstop of support from the political level if decisions are willing to be made, where the money comes in as the marginal dollar, not as the foundation dollar.
Definitely. And I think what I wanted to underline is basically how private participants drive that process. In the case of Mexico and Guatemala, we saw a Mexican company win an auction in Guatemala for supply energy. It's going to be done by a company in Monterrey. And the fact that that company had won a contract in Guatemala made the Guatemalan authorities willing to make some adjustment to transmission lines so as to make sure that the electricity could actually be imported and to comply with the contract. In the year that just has passed, we saw a project, a combined cycle plant in Texas, connect to Mexico and start exporting energy from Texas exclusively to Mexico system. And we saw a wind farm in Baja California start to export electricity exclusively for the California market. And that's those private movers are actually make us governments do things to allow them to comply with those things. And I think there are lots of opportunities in Central America. And I completely agree with you. There has to be a bottom-up force, and it has to be complemented by a top-down structured approach that helps them to achieve their goals.
But this is not a window that remains open forever. And Duncan, this is to your point before about natural gas. Look, we're looking at complete changes to the and how do you take advantage of those changes, those opportunities? But the reason I say the window doesn't necessarily stay open forever is because whenever every decision that's made across the region that involves a major investment in infrastructure closes the window on something else. Because if countries start saying, well, I'm not only going to think about my neighbors and my place within the neighborhood, I'm going to look at the short term right now, and I can get a small LNG plant, or I can get a small power plant on this place or that place. Once that investment is made, you're locked in, because you just made $1 billion investment.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to say, well, a new opportunity came along 2 years later. The company hasn't made any money on it yet because that's an 8-year recapitalization, but we're going to go in a new direction. So you have this opportunity now where countries can come together and have that discussion of what are we doing and where should it be. You don't need LNG facilities in every single country in the region. That's not necessarily the answer. You have to have infrastructure in some places, supplies come from others, and an integration of a flow of a market that trades based on wherever the cost and the need drives. I also think we're just at the beginning of understanding how gas can be delivered to smaller markets, because scale has been a barrier for LNG trade. So if you're a Caribbean island, or if you're a small country that's not interconnected, it may not make sense to build a LNG onshore regasification facility. But now we have FSRUs, we have floating storage and regasification units that cost a fraction because you lease them, and they can be ready in a year. You also have CNG, you have different abilities of companies, AES, others are looking at how do I make it commercial to be able to deliver small quantities. So I think we're also in this very exciting period of time of understanding where the technology is going and making sure we don't make investments that lock us into something that is we're not trying to, the equivalent of running wires for thousands of kilometers when we're going to off-grid and microgrids and new technologies that don't need that anymore.
Just to complement on what you said, another interesting thing about Mexico's opening is that Mexico, in a way, has some areas of the countries that are like the Caribbean. So, for instance, we are currently auctioning a project to supply natural gas to the Baja California Peninsula because it works as if it was an island. Basically, we are burning a lot of fuel and a lot of diesel and a lot of fuel oil there, where more efficient and cheaper ways of generating electricity are available. And the auction was left technology neutral. So basically, you could choose to put an LNG plant, you could choose some compressed gas, you could choose anything. You could even offer to build a transmission line which supply the peninsula. So it's an experiment. It's basically, we'll see how it goes, and we'll start to learn things. We have also in Cozumel, in some of the islands in the Mexican Caribbean, which also have the same problem. How do we get electricity there or energy in a cheaper way? And we are in a process in which the market will allow us to experiment in a way that may offer some solutions for some of our neighbors as well.
I think it's clear that you gentlemen could riff off each other all day, and we'd love to be to let you do this. I'd like to extend the invitation for you to come back next year and do it in the 3rd annual North American Energy Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a short break at this point, about 10 minutes. We're running about 15 minutes behind schedule. We'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll reconvene for the final panel of the day on electricity futures. But please first join me in thanking our panelists.
Good to see you. Good to see you.